Welcome back to the conversation. I'm joined here now by my friend Jonathan Larson, and we're going to talk about the newly appointed Deputy Chief of Staff to the incoming Biden administration, Bruce Reed. This is somebody who we've been talking a lot about on TYT, and Jonathan has been looking at very closely. This is somebody who in many ways has tracked the right wing of the Democratic Party going back to the very early 1980s. And it's wild to think that here in 2020, he's coming into a high level in the Biden administration. Jonathan, what was your reaction when you first heard that news?
Well, so I just to be clear, I actually did this story, the one we're talking about today, before the appointment became public. And I was doing it sort of anticipating the possibility of an education appointment.
Sure, and he had, right,
and maybe we should explain.
He had been floated as OMB director as well, and Biden administration put Neera Tan in there and said, "Aren't you lefties happy? You know, we put Neera in here instead of Bruce Reed."
So. Right. And especially once OMB was off the table, I just thought, well, it would be interesting to see where might he go next. So I just, did what you do. I started looking at his CV, and it turns out that for 2 years he ran this philanthropic institute called the Broad Foundation, which essentially had the mission of, if not privatizing outright, charterizing whole swaths of the public school system. And so the first thing I thought there was, well, given Reed's record in terms of pushing austerity measures on the social safety net, all kinds of things like that, being, as you put it, sort of on the conservative end of the Democratic Party when it came to things like the crime bill and welfare and all that kind of stuff in the 90s. The first thing I thought was, well, I wonder whether there's any intersection between DeVos's philanthropic pursuit of charter schools and more, and the Broad Foundation, which Reed was running at the time. And as you know, we found out there was, right? They did actually funnel some of their money to groups that were led by Betsy DeVos. And so now we know that Reed is going to be Deputy Chief of Staff. And so the question is, well, what issues, right, fall under the Deputy Chief of Staff's purview, which I would imagine would be roughly all. And then
right. Correct.
What, right? I mean, you would know better than I do, but that's
no, you got it.
Yeah. And then the follow-up question is, well, then what will he be doing about that, at least in terms of education for the purposes of this story? And you probably have some decent insights on what role a Deputy Chief of Staff would play, where that influence might be felt.
Well, it depends, because at that level, it gets into turf. And so, the chief of staff obviously has control over everything, insofar as he or she can express their will. Everyone, kind of below them, then, jockeys for turf underneath them. And so, but it is interesting to think about Bruce Reed in the context of the DeVos family, because you might think, well, DeVos family, these are extreme dominionist right wingers. What on earth could they possibly have in common, with somebody who is so close to Joe Biden? Well, if you look at Bruce Reed's history, he's co-founder-ish of the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council, which, as viewers may or may not know, was kind of established, kind of fight the progressive wing of the Democratic Party in the early 1980s. It eventually gave gave birth to the kind of Clinton campaign. The Clinton was an early leader of the DLC, and this element of the party kind of evolved into what we have today as the right wing of the party. And so you could see how the values that they were trying to bring into the party align very closely with the DeVos wing. What did Reed do while he was with this organization? What were the objectives of this organization, and what kind of groups was he working with?
Well, so I just want to quickly add a quick note to what you just said, laying out Reed's history. DeVos, I think people forget, was not toxic for her entire career with the Democratic Party, right? Cory Booker sat on boards of some of these groups with her at her invitation. So it wasn't until I think post-Trump, and even Eli Broad, the billionaire behind the Broad Foundation, he disavowed, I shouldn't say disavowed, because there was no public embrace of her beforehand, but he opposed her, or at least spoke out in opposition when she was appointed to the Trump cabinet as Secretary of Education. In terms of what Reid did at the Broad Foundation, it's really opaque, right? As you know, these organizations operate in almost total secrecy. They don't have to disclose their donors, so and they don't have to disclose what they ask for from the organizations they donate to. And the Broad Foundation sent money before, during, and after Reid's tenure to a huge constellation of these groups. A handful of them were led by DeVos and people, including one guy who's now Secretary for Assistant Secretary of Education for Policy. He was in that mix as well, but also to groups that were funded by DeVos and groups that were also funded by the Waltons and others. And Andre Perry at the Brookings Institution, he wrote a lot about the effect of some of these, I wouldn't say AstroTurf necessarily, but these rich foundations helped sort of fund a schism, for instance, in the Black community between pro-charter parents, Black parents, and anti-charter parents. And you saw a lot of that stuff play out in New Orleans. And Andre Perry writes about the fact that the effect of these foundations coming in and funding these really robust, well-funded pro-charter movements, which are also generally anti-labor, if not trying to do away with unions entirely. The Broad Foundation funded lawsuits or groups that were behind lawsuits that were aimed at weakening teacher protections in terms of tenure and things along those lines. But as Perry writes, the schools are not just educational institutions, they're community institutions. And so what happened was in some of these cities, you had really significant portions of the Black community's middle class just shut out of jobs. Like the middle class in specific cities and communities were decimated by some of these movements, and the communities themselves lost these sort of communal hubs as well. So it had a ripple effect beyond, beyond just the sort of the charter versus labor aspect, I would say.
For sure, and some of that was actually by design. The Dominionist church that DeVos was a part of, and DeVos herself has talked about this. That there was a real animosity that her kind of parents, who had kind of brought her into this community, had toward the public school, because they felt like the public school was supplanting the rightful place of the church as the center of the community. That they saw people organizing their free society, their community around the local school, and they thought that was
around a secular institution.
A secular institution, and that was godless, and that people ought to be organizing their communities around the church. And so that kind of led to this, that fed this assault then on this secular institution. If we drive this institution out, then the godly one, will come back and we'll have our godly community again. But so people understand, Bruce Reid, was at the Clinton White House while Joe Biden was writing the crime bill. He worked that. I think that's how they first met. Bruce Reid was helping Joe Biden with the crime bill. Bruce Reid was part of the deficit commission that Biden chaired. He kind of has staffed that. What do you expect to see? His influence be in a Biden administration?
Well, it's really interesting, at least in terms of education, right? I'm blanking on the name of the new education secretary's nominee.
Cardona, yeah.
Thank you, right. He doesn't have a big profile in terms of policy on this stuff, and he doesn't have a big national constituency behind him. He doesn't bring a large power base to this role. So potentially, especially on an area where there's not going to be a lot of media attention, potentially that could be seen by Reid as like a weak link, an area where he could exert some influence. Whether that happens, we'll have to wait and see, I guess.
Well, John, this was some tremendous reporting on your part. Thanks for bringing this to light. And you were prescient. It turned out that he was indeed, even though he got passed over for OMB director, going to get a high-level position in the Biden administration. I guess the best the left can take from this is that they pushed him all the way down to deputy chief of staff rather than anything more powerful. Thanks again for joining us in the conversation.
Thanks so much, Ryan.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.